There is a tendency to view J.B. Pritzker as a living contradiction. He is a billionaire heir to the Pritzker fortune. Other than Donald Trump, he is the wealthiest person to have ever held elected office in the United States. But at the same time, he has raised the minimum wage, supported the workers' rights constitutional amendment, and gained the respect of many progressives. So what's the deal here? Well, I don't actually think that Governor Pritzker's wealth and views are actually that much in contradiction. The more I learn about his life, the more I see the ways in which his wealth and privileged background, alongside the political and economic conditions that surround him, have shaped him into exactly who he is. That is the story I want to tell today. How JB pursued his own path, inspired and informed by his family and surroundings, and became the governor of the great state of Illinois, and now a potential contender for president. So let's go ahead and dive into it and play the intro.
But in all the history of the world, you, the people, have never had a voice.
Somebody somewhere is pushed back. The status quo pushes back.
Learning and labor.
Right there on the Senate floor, it's not God bless America, God damn America. Yeah.
We made mistakes. At times, we lost sight of our ideals.
That is their motto. Yours not to reason why, yours but to do and die.
Would that be fucking funny? Hilarious.
Welcome back to the Learning and Labor podcast. I'm your host, Nico, and today we're going to be talking about the life of J.B. Pritzker. Some of you might have noticed that this episode has a new intro, same music, some different voices and quotes thrown in there. Let me know if you recognize some of those down below. We are going to get into at least one of those clips in this episode today, which deals with J.B. Pritzker and a certain other Illinois governor who will play a probably pretty small part in our story, but an interesting one nonetheless. Before we get started today, I want to shout out some of the folks that helped read some quotes that you'll be hearing in this episode. Hal, who read some quotes from the members of the Pritzker family. My mom, who I had on the last episode talking about international tax on higher education. She read some quotes from some journalists discussing the Pritzker family. And Trevor, who read quotes from the man himself, J.B. Pritzker. They helped bring some variety to the episode, so you're not just listening to my voice the entire time. Which if you are, there listening to my voice a lot, I understand, it can be tough. I mean, no one has done it more than me editing this podcast, so I understand where you're coming from. Be sure to check out the sources in the description if you want to see where we got this information from or learn more. And let's go ahead and just dive into the story of J.B. Pritzker. To really understand J.B. Pritzker, we need to first talk about the members of the Pritzker family that came before him. The Pritzker lore goes back a long way, but the easiest place to start is probably with Nicholas Pritzker, a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant who arrived in Chicago in 1881. Nicholas Pritzker founded the family law firm, which would later be known as Pritzker & Pritzker, and would serve as a hub for the family's financial empire. In 1988, CNN profiled the Pritzker family, and they noted very little about Nicholas Pritzker other than a small book he left with the following theme.
Your only immortality is the impact you have on your successors.
This ethos would continue through generations of Pritzkers, who emphasized the importance of the family legacy. The next generation of Pritzkers would be led by Nicholas Pritzker's son, Abram Nicholas Pritzker, known as Abe, or more commonly by his initials, A.N. A.N. Pritzker graduated from Harvard University in 1920 with a law degree and also joined the family firm. Taking advantage of low prices during the Great Depression, A.N. and his brother Jack would begin to build the family's wealth through real estate dealings. A.N. Pritzker would also begin several important family traditions. The first was philanthropy, including considerable donations to educational institutions which now share his name, such as the Pritzker School of Medicine at the University of Chicago and the A.N. Pritzker Elementary School. This is something the members of the Pritzker family still champion today, and in JB's first campaign for governor, he highlighted his philanthropy as a positive asset for his candidacy. The second family tradition, tax avoidance, was not one the governor has strived to associate himself with. Under A.N.'s leadership, the family structured their wealth in a complex series of hundreds of trusts, many of which are located in the Bahamas, which allowed them to very effectively evade taxes. When Aaron Pritzker died, his family claimed his estate was only worth $25,000, in yet another attempt to avoid giving up any of their wealth. Of course, the traditions of tax avoidance and philanthropy are also connected. While some of the Pritzkers' charitable giving definitely goes to what you could call a good cause, charitable donations also serve to enhance their wealth. According to a 2018 report from the Better Government Association, the majority of the proceedings from the Pritzker Family Foundation, a charity run by the family, came from the same offshore Bahamas trust funds set up by A.N. Pritzker. Because they transferred these funds from these untaxed offshore accounts to a charitable organization, they avoided paying any taxes as they would for any other kind of expenditure. On top of the tax benefits, their donations have raised the family's social standing, building financial connections and associating the Pritzker family with good deeds. In other words, philanthropy and tax avoidance are simply smart business, and the Pritzkers are certainly smart businessmen. No one exemplified that more than A.N.'s son, who would become the leader of the next generation of the Pritzker family. His name was Jay Pritzker. If you've been to the Millennium Park in Chicago, you may have seen his name on the Pritzker Pavilion, which is another product of the family's philanthropy. Under Jay's leadership, the family's wealth took its modern form. Jay invested heavily in many different industrial and commercial sectors, often taking over companies and turning them over to his brother Robert to manage. While Jay was definitely the biggest name and pursued the big deals that made the family rich, Rob, who had an engineering background, played an important role as the competent manager of the companies that Jay would buy. The most famous source of the Pritzkers' modern wealth, however, ended up being managed by A.N.'s third son, Donald. In 1957, the family acquired the Hyatt Hotel in Los Angeles. 4 years later, Jay would send his younger brother Donald to California to manage the Hyatt Company, which was now expanding to a national hotel chain. CNN's profile on the Pritzker describes Donald as follows.
He gave the little organization flair and momentum. He was short, like most of the Pritzker men, and fat, unlike them. He had a captivating smile, an uproarious laugh, and a wit that would show up a stand-up comedian. With Don in charge, but always clearing big decisions with Jay, Hyatt grew rapidly.
Donald and his wife Sue, alongside managing the growing Hyatt empire, would raise 3 children in Atherton, California. First there was their daughter Penny, then their son Anthony, who is known as Tony, and finally their youngest child, named after Donald's brothers, J. Robert Pritzker. He would go by JB. Growing up, JB was surrounded by a growing world of technology in the area that would become known as Silicon Valley. David Packard, the founder of tech giant Hewlett-Packard, lived right down this road from the Pritzkers. In a 2014 Chicago Magazine profile, JB described Packard as
a crazy guy doing something in his garage.
Probably inspired by this environment and his family's business dealings, JB would apparently start trying to make some money of his own at a pretty young age. According to his brother Tony,
He started buying gum wholesale and then selling it on the bus for the profit. To finance that, he created a little company and issued shares. He did pretty well.
But technology and business were not the only interests of a young Pritzker. It seemed clear from a young age that his true calling came elsewhere.
I was always fascinated by politics, and I was exposed to it quite a lot.
In his campaign and tenure as governor, JB has routinely cited one moment from his childhood as inspiration for his political values. While still in elementary school, his mother took him to a pro-choice protest.
I view all of what I do to fight for women's rights and for reproductive rights, and frankly LGBTQ rights. Those are all things that I think my mother would want me to do.
And alongside these social causes, he was surrounded by the world of the Democratic Party.
I was riding around the neighborhood with bumper stickers for Jimmy Carter in 1976. My father was the finance chair for Ed Muskie in California when he ran for president. And my mother was the finance chair for U.S. Senator John Tooney.
As JB describes, his parents were heavily involved in the party, often advising Democratic politicians on finance policy. It seems pretty likely, even, that Donald Pritzker would actually run for office one day himself. And as the 1972 election approached, Donald worked as the finance chair for Maine Senator Edmund Muskie's presidential campaign. And before we continue along with the Pritzker story, I just want to stop for a second and paint a picture of the Muskie campaign. It's truly a bizarre story, and while I can't say for sure how much it actually impacted Donald Pritzker or JB, but it at the very least served as the backdrop of what would come next. And honestly, it was such a fascinating story that I didn't really want to leave it out. So basically, Ed Muskie had been the Democratic Party's vice presidential candidate alongside Hubert Humphrey in 1968, and he was favored to take the top spot as the presidential candidate in the subsequent primary. But that all changed in February of 1972, when the so-called Canuck letter was published in a conservative newspaper. Along with attacking Muskie's wife, the letter alleged that Muskie was bigoted towards French-Canadian Americans, which was a major constituency in the Northeast that would be important in the primaries. This was seen as somewhat of a bad look at the time. It was also a complete lie, manufactured by the Richard Nixon campaign with the help of the conservative media, and Muskie was determined to issue a strong denial, gathering for a press conference in Manchester, New Hampshire, outside the newspaper's office. This press conference did not go well. Media outlets reported that Muskie was crying and choking up during the speech, and while his allies maintained that this was actually just because of the snowstorm that was taking place at the time, there was still a common perception of it being a very odd performance. Former Muskie aides and a CIA officer even speculated that someone dosed him with LSD as part of Nixon's secret plan to derail his campaign. But regardless of what actually went down on that day, this Canuck letter saga was widely considered to have firmly ended Muskie's chances in the primary. He ended up losing to fellow Democrat George McGovern, just as Nixon had wanted, and McGovern went on to lose the general election in a landslide. So a few months after this happened, we have another moment in the Pritzker family story, and unfortunately this one is quite a tragic one. In the summer of 1972, Donald Pritzker had a heart attack while playing tennis at a Hyatt location in Honolulu. His death at the age of 39 would leave his wife Sue with 3 young children. Penny was 13, Tony was 11, and JB was only 7 years old. For the following decade, Sue Pritzker would suffer with alcoholism. This would lead to JB and his siblings spending a lot of time outside the house, including at boarding school and in Chicago with their Pritzker relatives. These circumstances would shape the 3 Pritzker siblings' lives immensely.
I think one of the reasons today that we're all 3 responsible sorts of people and have the ability to carry crises on our shoulders is because we had to band together to deal with these circumstances. I want to be clear. My mother, to me, was a hero. She fought her alcoholism. Really fought. She found someone to take care of us for a couple of weeks so she could check herself into a rehab program. She went to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings and was sober on and off. But she would fall off the wagon.
Tragically, Sue's struggle with alcoholism would end in her death in 1982 in a traffic accident. 10 years after they had lost their father, JB and his siblings became orphans. These traumatic events clearly shaped them tremendously in ways that I cannot completely understand. But one thing that remains clear is that a young JB Pritzker remained interested in following in his parents' footsteps and eventually pursuing political office. When attending college, most members of the Pritzker family would study business or engineering. But JB was different, and he chose political science. He started attending Georgetown, but later transferred to Duke, where he finished his degree. Afterwards, he attended Northwestern for law school. During this time, he would start his first work in politics, working for Democratic politicians Tom Lantos, Terry Sanford, and Alan Dixon. While working for them in D.C., he would be set up on a blind date with Mary Catherine Munster, who, like JB, would also just go by her initials. JB felt that MK was out of his league, as she was dating a star basketball player at the time. But according to MK, his kindness and humor won her over, and they would get married in 1993, the same year JB graduated from law school. The couple would go on to settle down in Evanston, Illinois, and JB would start working at the Chicago Corporation, which is an investment bank that provided him opportunity to work with the same kind of group of tech business people that he had grown up around in California. Seeing a business opportunity in the growing online sector, he and his brother Tony started New World Ventures in 1995, which wound up with some pretty successful investments in startup internet companies. With some success under his belt, JB decided it was time to throw his hat in the ring for political office. With the incumbent resigning, Illinois' 9th Congressional District was opening up, and JB took his chance, running for the Democratic nomination. While some of his opponents might have had more political experience, Pritzker had his wealth and his connections, spending $1 million on the campaign. However, this was not enough to win him the seat, or even second place in the primary. Jan Schakowsky, a state legislator who had been carefully waiting for years for the incumbent to resign so this seat could become hers, was victorious, and JB placed third. This defeat was pretty crushing, and Jay Pritzker, the leader of the Pritzker family at the time, encouraged JB to learn from it.
He told me that I could accomplish many public policy goals by making money and going without the public life.
That is, after all, how the Pritzkers had traditionally done it. Stay out of the public eye, do good business, and privately use your money for charity and influencing politics. As we know, JB would ultimately not follow this advice. But before we discuss Pritzker's future moves in the world of politics, we need to take a step back and look at the whole Pritzker family and the chaos that would soon shake their world. The events I will describe next were a highly controversial affair. I know that there will be perspectives I miss when describing them, but I'm just going to do my best to give an honest description of the events that permanently changed the Pritzker family. The first thing that really set things off was the death of Jay Pritzker from a heart attack in January of 1999. Up until this point, Jay had served as the figurehead for the Pritzker family, following in his father's footsteps. Jay had a very specific vision for how the family should be run. He valued smart management of the family wealth and business, but he didn't want them to be viewed as a symbol of excess. In his letter explaining his wishes for the family after his death, he outlined that everyone's reasonable needs should be met, and that it was primarily important to keep the series of family trusts together for as long as they legally could. With Jay's instructions, the family resources were placed in the control of 3 members of the family that he trusted the most. Jay's oldest son, Tom, his cousin, Nicholas, not to be confused with the original Nicholas Pritzker, and his niece, Penny. This decision created some issues, because there were now many adult members of the Pritzker family who wanted their own share of the fortune. While Jay was alive, they kept their ambitions at bay, and they worked to keep any conflict out of the public eye. However, things would change after his death. As put by Susanna Andrews in the Vanity Fair article Shattered Dynasty,
The day of the funeral was the last time that many of Jay Pritzker's friends saw his 3 sons together. The moment that sticks in their memories is how lovingly his sons spoke of their father, because what they did next would surely have destroyed him.
So, it was not long after his funeral that Jay's younger sons, John and Daniel, would take action to change the arrangement that put power in the hands of their older brother and relatives. And these 2 were not the only members of the family dissatisfied with Tom, Penny, and Nicholas taking control of the Pritzker trusts. Penny's younger siblings, Tony and his brother JB, were also very frustrated by their exclusion, and they joined together with John and Daniel to demand a change to the arrangement. They claimed that the triumvirate were taking control of the money for themselves instead of distributing it to the family, and they demanded a change. Just to be clear here, everyone involved in this story already had millions of dollars, and they were going to be given millions more dollars from the series of Pritzker trusts. But these millions were small stakes compared to the billions of dollars in wealth the Pritzker family possessed in total, and the conflict over this money got quite vicious and personal. Eventually, Tom, Nicholas, and Penny relented and agreed to relinquish control and split the family fortune between themselves and Jay's other children, nieces, and nephews. There were, however, 2 individuals that were excluded from this arrangement, Liesl and Matthew. They were younger than their cousins and not in consideration for leading this next generation when Jay made his choice. In fact, they had a very troubled relationship with their father, Rob Pritzker, who had gained control of their trusts and emptied them. In 2002, Liesl sued for their portion of the family fortune, eventually resulting in an 11-way split of the Pritzker cash. This lawsuit also dramatically changed the family's image, because while Tom, Nicholas, and Penny's concession had been made in a difficult internal family struggle, this lawsuit made the family drama public. So, for the first time, the Pritzker family was no longer a single financial powerhouse led by a patriarch or his appointed successors. Instead, the tightly managed family finances were split between the fighting siblings and cousins, creating nearly a dozen independent billionaires. With over a decade to reflect on this period, JB would frame the situation as a very troubling time.
No matter how much wealth anybody has, family problems are about the same across the board. Then throw in financial matters, and it does complicate things quite a lot. We decided that the best way to resolve it was to let everybody separate their assets and let time heal.
After this family drama, JB remained close with his brother Tony, who he worked with to found the Pritzker Group, carrying on his previous investment business work. However, he was not on speaking terms with his sister Penny for years after the family feud. And despite the late Jay Pritzker's recommendation that he go without the public life, JB continued to pursue a role in the Democratic Party. In his home state of Illinois, his wealth and influence made him an important part of the political scene, and he secured an appointment from Governor Rod Blagojevich as part of the state's Human Rights Commission. In the build-up to the 2008 presidential campaign, JB was a close ally, fundraiser, and backer of Hillary Clinton, even serving as a national co-chair on her campaign. Meanwhile, his sister Penny backed Illinois Senator Barack Obama, pitting the two siblings on opposite sides of another conflict. Now, as we all know, Obama won that Democratic primary and the subsequent presidential election. So JB's sister Penny had backed the right person and was subsequently appointed as the Commerce Secretary in Obama's administration. JB was not so lucky, but Obama's election did open up some interesting opportunities in his home state. You see, with Obama leaving the US Senate, Governor Rod Blagojevich was able to appoint a replacement for this coveted position. On top of that, it was speculated that other Illinois politicians might leave their positions to take office in the Obama administration. Some of you might be familiar with what happened next, as Governor Blagojevich was eventually convicted for attempting to sell the Senate seat to the highest bidder. JB didn't seem to want to be appointed as a senator, but perhaps was interested in some of the state-level positions that could open up. The evidence of this, from recorded phone calls between JB and Rod Blagojevich, which were secured through an FBI wiretap and made public years later, paint an interesting picture of his political ambitions. After suggesting Illinois Secretary of State Jesse White as a good pick for U.S. Senator, we can get a sense of JB's attitude towards taking advantage of this situation to secure a political spot for himself.
Of all the African Americans I can think that are sort of like qualified and vetted, and people will say, "Oh, that's a pretty good pick." The one that is least offensive and maybe gets you the most because it gets you that Secretary of State appointment is Jesse White.
You can argue he's got a lot in common with Obama. He's black and white. How stupid is that? Hey, no, he'd be a legitimate pick.
I'm not pushing anybody.
No, I understand. You don't want to be Secretary of State, do you, JB?
Oh, I wasn't pushing for me for Secretary of State. I mean, I think I could probably do that job, but that's not.
So while he wasn't explicitly pushing for a position, JB was framing himself as someone well-suited for public office. There is also some audio of the two men joking about appointing figures considered to be on the more radical left to the position, which I found to be very interesting.
Good. Hey, how about this one? God, if I knew for sure I wasn't running again.
Yeah.
How about Reverend Wright?
Oh, my God. Still there.
Yeah. No, how about fucking sending Reverend Wright there? I bet you he'd take it.
Hilarious.
Huh? Would that be fucking funny?
Hilarious.
Oh, yeah. Right there on the Senate floor. It's not God bless America. God damn America.
God damn America.
When Barack was at Sunday school, I used to tell him.
I love it. That's funny.
And in case you aren't familiar with the names that they're mentioning here, Reverend Jeremiah Wright is a pastor from Chicago who is known for his criticism of U.S. imperialism and repression caused by the U.S. government.
The government gives them the drugs, builds bigger prisons, passes a 3-strike law, and then wants us to sing God Bless America? No, no, no. Not God Bless America. God damn America. That's in the Bible for killing innocent people. God damn America for treating us citizens as less.
He was a very controversial figure in the 2008 election because people were associating him with Obama because Obama did attend his church, and Obama was trying to distance himself from the Reverend. The other person they mentioned, Bill Ayers, is a retired professor who at the time worked at the University of Illinois, Chicago. He is known as an organizer who co-founded the revolutionary militant group Weather Underground. But beyond these jokes about appointing radical lefties to the Senate, Pritzker did seem much more genuinely interested in becoming Illinois treasurer in another recording with Blagojevich.
I just heard this morning that Alex might get appointed to something in Washington.
I think you appoint his replacement, don't you?
Ooh, interesting. Let's think about that. You interested in that?
That's the one I would want.
Ultimately, this treasurer position did not end up becoming vacant and open up for J.B. Pritzker. But this moment shows that he was keeping an eye out for any opportunity that arose to fulfill his longtime dream of holding public office. In the meantime, J.B. would continue to play a more behind-the-scenes role in the world of politics. As his political ally Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State, Pritzker would join the board of pro-Israel lobbying group AIPAC. In her 2010 speech to AIPAC, Hillary Clinton would give Pritzker and other members of the board a shout-out.
It is wonderful to be back at AIPAC with so many good friends. I also want to thank David Victor and Howard Kohr and Lonnie Kaplan and J.B. Pritzker.
And along with shaping foreign policy, J.B. became perhaps even more influential than he already was in Illinois politics and business, with Chicago Magazine dubbing him the other mayor of Chicago in a 2014 profile. Pritzker was especially involved in the world of technology, which he had been surrounded by since he was a child. In 2012, he founded 1871, a nonprofit organization that helps digital tech startups. 1871 was often compared to other office-sharing organizations like WeWork, but it was able to best the competition in Chicago through securing some significant public funding from the state of Illinois, which some private competitors felt was kind of unfair. They didn't have the connections of JB after all. The 1871 offices were frequently visited by high-profile guests, with Mayor Rahm Emanuel and Governor Pat Quinn making regular visits, and even David Cameron, then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, stopping by. JB also worked with Rahm Emanuel to lead Chicago Next, with the stated goal to promote entrepreneurship, attract investment, and create jobs in digital, clean technology, and life sciences sectors. All of these efforts were part of JB's goal to make Illinois known by a similar moniker as his Southern California birthplace. Instead of Silicon Valley, JB was very serious about building a Silicon Prairie. Back to the family front, JB continued to be close business partners with his brother Tony, and he and his sister seemed to be reconnecting after the heated family drama a decade prior. The Pritzker brothers continued to expand their investments, which today include a wide range of companies primarily in the tech sector. Some interesting investments and former investments listed on their website are Cameo, which provides personalized celebrity videos, including of Rod Blagojevich, Coinbase, a cryptocurrency trading platform, and Pluto TV, the streaming service. The Pritzkers also invest and acquire companies outside of the tech sector, and in fact, while I was researching for this episode, a former worker at one of those companies, ProAmpac, reached out to me sharing his experience. Essentially, from straight out of high school, he was working 12-hour night shifts in the company's Pritzker-owned factories, and he told me that during these lengthy shifts, he was told that he could not sit down even during long periods where there was no work to be done. I mention this just because ProAmpac is one of the countless companies J.B. Pritzker has profited from, and I of course don't know the working conditions at all of them, but I think this kind of anecdote is important to keep in mind. Ultimately, the wealth that JB and his family members receive from their investments is built off the hard work of others. Some of these corporations, like Hyatt, which is the one most associated publicly with the Pritzker family, have many unionized locations, which does help make sure workers get their fair share. But simply having a union absolutely does not give management and the owners of this off the hook, and it doesn't prevent exploitation from your employer. In fact, Hyatt management has been accused of union busting at some of their locations. So while JB has supported positive changes for workers in Illinois, like protecting the rights to organize a union and a state constitutional amendment, the full context of his support for workers is certainly more complicated than that. Anyway, let's get back to talking about his rise as a political figure. The political landscape was changing, and while it would have its ups and downs, things would end up looking pretty good for J.B. Pritzker. In the 2016 presidential election, JB and his wife were major fundraisers and donors to Hillary Clinton, ultimately donating $14 million directly to pro-Clinton super PACs. Perhaps if Hillary Clinton had been elected president, JB could have received a position in her administration, or otherwise politically benefited from a longtime ally taking the country's highest office. But, as we all know, Donald Trump would become president, and JB would instead turn to focus on his home state of Illinois. 2 years before the country had a shift from a Democratic to a Republican administration, Illinois had done the same thing. Despite its reputation as a solid blue state, During the 2014 election, Illinoisans elected a Republican billionaire as governor. His name was Bruce Rauner, and he defeated Pat Quinn, who had taken over as governor after Rod Blagojevich had been arrested and impeached for corruption. Along with the scandal-ridden nature of the Illinois Democrats, 2014 overall saw a very poor performance for the party. However, both Bruce Rauner and Donald Trump, the Republican businessmen turned politicians, would see their popularity plummet. Nationwide, there was a growing resistance to the Trump administration's many right-wing policies and attacks on working people. And in Illinois, a lot of people were fed up with Rauner's austerity politics, which had led to a budget crisis and significant cuts to education. So, JB decided it was his chance to run for governor. In the primary, he placed first by 18 points. JB was able to defeat progressive state legislator Daniel Biss and a member of the Kennedy family. In the general election, he beat incumbent Bruce Rauner by over 15% of the vote. It seems like JB had learned some lessons 20 years after his first time running for office, which ended in an embarrassing electoral defeat. Pritzker had run a smart campaign, presenting himself as a steward of progressive policies and responsible economic management. He also spent a lot of money on this. Adjusted for inflation, he spent around 75 times more of his own money on his 2018 gubernatorial campaign compared to his 1998 congressional run, which ended up totaling $171 million. While Rauner would also spend millions of his own money, it would definitely not be enough to stay in office. So JB had finally done it. While his sister Penny was the first to hold a prominent position in government, he had been the first in the family to do so through winning an election. And now JB was governor of the country's 6th most populous state. That is for now where we're going to wrap up this story about JB Pritzker's life. Of course, there's a ton of things you can discuss about JB's time as governor, where he might go next, but I'm going to save that for a future episode. I've also already talked about this a little bit in episode 11, which was an interview with the person who runs the social media account, Nomadic Warriors for Pritzker, Trip, which was a great conversation kind of about the Midwest populism that exists right now and how JB fits into all of that. As I said in the beginning, JB Pritzker is not a contradiction, but the opposite. It is only because of his roots in the Pritzker family that he has become the person he is today and become admired by so many. Originally, the Pritzker family was united under A.N. and J. Pritzker, and they prided themselves in a few different skills. These included competent economic management, spending on philanthropy to advance personal and public causes, and the careful maintenance of a limited public image. On the route to becoming governor and as a politician in office, JB has embraced these very same skills. He highlights his record as a financial manager all the time, talking about the fact that he balanced the budget of Illinois and improved the state's credit rating. And along with his family traditionally being associated with management of business in a way that makes steady profits, this directly followed in his parents' footsteps, moving up from financially advising Democrats to actually being the Democrat managing a state's economy directly. JP would use his private spending not only to contribute to charity and avoid taxes, as his family frequently has, but to raise his political profile and build connections. He worked closely with the Democratic Party establishment in Illinois. Alongside the millions spent on the Hillary Clinton campaign, JB donated $100,000 to Rod Blagojevich, $182,000 to Rahm Emanuel, and over $400,000 to Pat Quinn. In fact, JB Pritzker continues to regularly donate hundreds of thousands of dollars to Democratic causes across the country. So the truth is, when he ran for governor in 2018, JB was already a part of the Democratic establishment that had rightfully earned a great deal of resentment from voters for their corruption. But he was able to present himself as somewhat of a new political force. And to some extent, you can see why. You can make a similar argument for Pritzker, which was made by Donald Trump when he ran for president in 2015. Trump argued that his opponents were corrupt and influenced by their donors, while he was independently wealthy and didn't even need those donors.
The donors, the special interests, the lobbyists have very strong power over these people. I am not accepting any money from anybody. Nobody has control of me other than the people of this country.
And while I think this wasn't really true for Trump, who has heavily relied on outside campaign donations, it could be argued that it is actually more accurate for JB Pritzker. Maybe this wouldn't apply if he ran for president or something, but his runs for governor did not need outside financing. He could rely on his vast fortune, which he regularly uses to support favored political causes. In this way, Pritzker's family wealth allows him to act as a somewhat independent political force, and be seen as separate from the Democratic Party establishment in some ways. Now, let's talk about the maintenance of JB's public image, which was also surely shaped by his family history. Prior to the family's splintering in the early 21st century, the Pritzkers were described as one of the nation's richest and most private families and a publicity-shy clan. To do this as one of the wealthiest families in the country requires a careful consideration and conscious decision-making to stay out of the public eye. And while I can't say for sure what exact skills and lessons J.B. Pritzker learned from his family's practices, he has definitely developed some skills at managing his public perception. Pritzker maintains a laser focus with his rhetoric on messaging that he believes will resonate with voters. From economic issues to abortion, he draws sharp distinctions between his positions and his Republican opponents. He is also very careful to navigate the ever-changing political landscape, just like the Pritzker-owned companies have had to do with their various economic situations. One topic I think is very interesting in this regard is that of Israel and Palestine. While JB has largely maintained his pro-Israel positions that one would expect from a former AIPAC board member, he has prevented that from defining his image. While many pro-Israel politicians frequently associate anti-Semitism with advocacy for Palestinians, JB more often simply includes anti-Semitism alongside other bigoted beliefs that must be opposed. A friend of mine mentioned to me recently that in JB's 2025 State of the State speech, he talked about a lot of forms of bigotry, including anti-Semitism, and didn't mention Israel at all. And while this seems to make a lot of sense and be a pretty obvious approach for a state governor who does not directly deal with foreign policy, this is sort of unique among some other Democratic governors that are associated with Israel more heavily. For example, Governor of Pennsylvania Josh Shapiro received widespread press coverage for his attempts to suppress pro-Palestine organizing at the University of Pennsylvania. You don't see the same kind of stories coming out about J.B. Pritzker. And while JB has spoke of his unequivocal support for Israel after the October 7th attacks, he has changed his positioning as the genocide in Gaza has continued and public sentiment has turned against Israel. In fact, JB has even recently said that blocking arms sales to Israel
sends the right kind of message,
although he has not called for an arms embargo. The Pritzker family, led by A.N. and J. Pritzker, was known for its skillful economic management, careful use of private funds to secure their aims, and a very limited public image. While JB has clearly gone away from some of the family traditions by pursuing a life in public office, it is there where he most clearly follows in the footsteps of his parents, Donald and Sue Pritzker. It is Donald and Sue who can be credited with sparking a young JB's interest in Democratic Party politics, and instilling the liberal social values that he always champions. Ultimately, when studying JB's life, it is clear that his political trajectory has been shaped by his family, rather than contradicting it. To put it simply, JB was born into and continues to be part of the liberal faction of the ruling class. To see the implications this has for his politics, we can look at some of the recent answers he has given when prompted by journalists to address the claims of someone to his left, Democratic Socialist politician Zohran Mamdani. When asked about Mamdani's comment that billionaires should not exist, J.B. Pritzker stated that,
"How much money you have doesn't determine what your values are."
Now this answer definitely sidesteps Mamdani's point, which has to do with something I pointed out earlier: the wealth of any billionaire is built on the backs of others. But what I think JB is getting at here is that among the wealthy, there are liberals and there are conservatives. And even if many other billionaires interested in politics and technology are super right-wing, it's not an inevitability. But of course, there are always going to be limits to what billionaires like J.B. Pritzker will support. Addressing Zohran's state-owned grocery plan, JB has said,
"I was a business person before I came into government. Government should be helping create these kinds of businesses, but shouldn't itself be running those businesses."
He believes the state has a role to play in supporting the growth of businesses where the free market fails. But he doesn't want to move past the profit-driven model of society. He has shown that he will support many reforms which may improve the conditions of working people, but he will not support a move towards a different system from the one we live under now. And frankly, we shouldn't expect him to. He was born into a family positioned firmly in the ruling class, and despite what many progressives that admire him may want, he has expressed no intention of betraying that class. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Learning and Labor podcast. All of the sources that I have used for this video will be available in the podcast description, which links to my sources document. And yeah, I think that's all I got for you today. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you have a different take on J.B. Pritzker, if you think there's something I missed or should cover in the future, definitely let me know. I'm very interested to hear it. I'd also appreciate if anybody rated this podcast, share it, like it, all the usual kind of stuff that supports the channel. If you're watching on YouTube, of course, that means subscribing. If you're watching on Spotify, you can follow, rate there. Apple Podcasts, you can rate it there. And I think that's all I've got for you today. So everybody, bye-bye, and I'll see you next time.
Learning and Labor. Station WILL has carried a special program this week giving information about the University of Illinois. If you have been a listener to these broadcasts, you have heard more or less about what the university does, how it does it, and what it hopes to do. Thank you, Dr. Willard.
But no, I think my problem, the only problem I can come up with for you, I got a lot of reasons why it makes sense. The problem for you would be same problem with the Senate, really. I've given you contributions.
Well, total non-issue. Well, first of all, you give money to everybody, like Lisa Madigan, okay?
Yeah. No.
Which, incidentally, if you can do for me what you did for her before the end of the year, can you think about that?